Hey, Michael, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, let's dive in. Tell us a little bit about you and what you do.
Yeah, so my name is Michael Jones. I run the YouTube channel Inspiring Philosophy, and we basically are a channel, a nonprofit organization that create videos defending Christianity, uh, arguing for the truth of it, dealing with objections, and we cover numerous topics. We try to cover as many topics as we possibly can.
How did you get into that?
So this was early on when YouTube was just sort of getting started back in like 2011. I noticed there weren't a lot of good Christian videos on YouTube at that point. There were some, but there weren't a lot of like good edited videos. There were lectures from some Christian speakers. There were some people that were just like young kids talking into a camera. And I wanted to try to create a better quality videos defending Christianity where I could incorporate graphics, refer people to books, use quotes and articles to make much better animated type style videos. And so that's how I got started back then. And so I tried to fill a niche that wasn't being filled at the time.
Cool. So your background is in philosophy, right?
Yeah, I got a master's in philosophy in 2022 at the University of Arizona.
Okay. So how did that kind of tie in with what you're doing with apologetics?
Yeah, I think philosophy is really the basis of all knowledge. You start asking why questions, that leads to so many other topics. You have to do philosophy of science before you can do science. You should have a good methodology that you would get from philosophy of history before you can study history. So I think we all need to start with philosophy to know what we believe, why we believe it, what we believe our knowledge is, where it comes from, what our ontology is, and then we can start exploring all these different branches. So I think we should all start with philosophy, figure that out, and then we can start studying other topics.
Okay. Um, can you explain how quantum mechanics supports the case for God?
Yeah, that's something I've talked about, and people get kind of upset about that because I'm not a quantum physicist. Well, I've never done quantum mechanics. I've only talked about the philosophical implications of quantum mechanics. So, one of the things we have in quantum mechanics is we have something called the wave function. And that is basically what is there prior to measurement. Now, what do I mean by that? So you have a particle, but when no one is measuring that particle, all that exists there is what physicists call the wave function. Now we have a problem, and it's aptly named the measurement problem. How do we go from a wave function, which is just a mathematical probability of where the particle could end up, to the particle? Well, typically you'd have some sort of equation to explain that transition, but nothing exists. This is why it's called the measurement problem. Okay, well, that has a lot of implications for reality because everything is made of quantum particles. How can things not be there when you're not looking at them, so to speak? Well, I've argued various arguments using this, but one I would call like a conscious argument for God's existence. Some people will say that our brains create a consciousness, and I'd push back against that. But in fact, I would argue that what solves the measurement problem is what physicists like Henry Stapp and John von Neumann argued, which is that a conscious agent interacts with the wave function and causes the physical particle to appear. Okay, well then, if matter, particles, is dependent on consciousness, where did our consciousness come from? You'd have to argue that it doesn't have a material source since it's necessary for material things. Therefore, it'd have to have some sort of personal source, which we would call God. Since we didn't create ourselves, we're not eternal, our consciousness would have to come from somewhere else. So we would call it something like the cosmic conscious argument. If matter is contingent on consciousness, where did consciousness come from? You'd argue that it comes from a personal source like God. That's one way you could do that.
Cool. Okay. So you've produced a lot of content on the reliability of the New Testament. What do you think is some of the strongest evidence that points to the Bible being accurate and true?
Yeah, I'll give two things here. So let's start with the Gospels. We say they are written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. A lot of modern historians, especially of the non Christian variety, reject that. So if you talk to like atheists, agnostics, Muslims, they'll be like, no, these were originally anonymous. Well, Simon Gathercole looked at all the biographies from the ancient world. He only found two that ever internally identified the author, and one was a fictional biography. Okay, so it just seems to have been the way that ancient authors wrote. If you were writing a biography, you would never internally identify yourself as the author. That was rare. Okay, well then let's look at what the early church fathers said. And if you look at the wide geographical region, so you have Irenaeus writing up in France, you have Tertullian writing in North Africa, you have Clement of Alexandria writing in Egypt, you have the Muratorian fragment, which probably came from Rome, you have Papias in modern day Turkey. Uh, all of them agree the gospel authors are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, they disagree about when the Gospels were written, the order they were written in, who was present when they were written, but they all agree the authors are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So their stories are not entirely the same, but that detail comes out is the same.
So those early church fathers that you mentioned, what year around did they live in regards to like when the Gospels were written?
So yeah, Papias is living early second century,
Mm-hmm.
so 125, 150. Then you have Irenaeus writing around like 180, Tertullian writing shortly after that. Same with Clement of Alexandria. So second century. So very, very close to when the Gospels were written. We're talking 1 century prior.
Mm-hmm.
And when they mention Gospel authors, it's always Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So since they're always corroborating that detail, but disagreeing on other details, that gives us good reason to trust that detail because they're telling us they're just not repeating the same story over and over again. They have
Mm-hmm.
different stories, but they still get that detail right. So that's likely to be true. And that's what forensic investigators would say too. When you have conflicting stories from different witnesses, but they get one detail right, that detail is probably likely to be true.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing we can do is we can look at something called onomastic congruence, which is just a fancy term for the names in the Gospels. If I were to ask you to write a biography of somebody living in Georgia 40 years ago, you'd have to have him interacting with a whole bunch of people. But also, you'd have to get the right distribution of names. So we know 40 years ago in Georgia, there was a name that was probably the most popular. There were names that were slightly less popular, and then there were unpopular names. It'd be very, very hard without using the internet or checking libraries or databases to get the right distribution of names. Like, I don't know what it is, but let's say the most popular name was Robert. The most people he should interact with should be people named Robert. And let's say, like, Caleb is a rare name. Well, then very few people he should interact with should have Caleb. It'd be very hard to get that right distribution of naming patterns. So there was a study done on the Gospels when it comes to this. The most popular names in ancient Palestine in the first century were names like Simon and Judas. These were very, very popular names. Nicodemus, Zacchaeus, these are very rare names. So what they did is they looked at things like the Apocrypha Gospels. They looked at the works of Josephus. They looked at modern novels, like the novel Ben-Hur, for example. And they asked, could any of these guys get the right naming distribution pattern that we see in the first century? None of them could. Josephus got a 6% accuracy. Modern novels got 0%. The Apocrypha Gospels got 0%. But the Gospels and Acts combined scored percentage points of 86% accuracy in terms of the naming distribution of the first century. That's incredibly rare. That just doesn't happen by chance. Fiction writers couldn't do that, as we saw from the variables they used.
Mm-hmm.
So that tells us what's most likely going on is the gospel writers were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, based on the testimony of the early church, but they were also interviewing eyewitnesses, real people that interacted with Jesus. That's why they get the right names of that time.
Mm-hmm.
So this is actually powerful data when you look into it, because fiction writers could not. We have no evidence any fiction writer could mimic such a thing, nor were they ever trying to. So those two things I think are the strongest case for gospel reliability.
That's such like an interesting way to think about it because you wouldn't necessarily be like, oh, let's look at the names and like that'll make it reliable, but it completely makes sense when you break it down. What about the resurrection?
Mm-hmm.
Why do we believe the resurrection actually happened? What are some of the arguments that this is historical?
Yeah, good question. So we need to. There's another conundrum in history. It's how do we go from Jesus being crucified uh, around 33 AD to less than a year later, his closest followers proclaiming he rose from the dead? How do we get from that belief? That's hard to explain. So scholars have to come up with all sorts of naturalistic explanations to account for why they went to this belief. Why do they hold to this belief? And so, what we argue is the best way to explain that data is that Jesus really did rise from the dead. But, like atheistic or agnostic scholars don't want to take that view. So, how do they get around it? So, they'll come up with various explanations. And we'll argue a lot of those explanations are ad hoc, meaning they're too convoluted, complicated to explain all the data. So, things like what we know about ancient Jewish messianic groups is they were expecting a conquering Messiah, someone who was going to defeat Rome. No one was expecting a Messiah who was supposed to come, die for the sins of humanity, including the Gentiles, and then resurrect in a glorified body ahead of the time of the general resurrection. This was unlike messianic belief, so it's completely out of place in terms of its Jewish cultural context. So we need to explain how that could come about naturally. How could the Christians have this odd belief? Uh, we also need to account for why they actually believed he rose from the dead. So when we look at like various explanations like hallucinations, uh, we know from modern research, Nick Meter, for example, has talked about this. He's a psychologist. We know from modern research that when people hallucinate, they rarely have these ideas that they believe people actually physically rose from the dead. They may think they experienced the ghosts of someone, uh, and they'll tend to experience them in like one sensory form. So like the auditorial, visual. Maybe they might smell something, but rarely they're going to experience somebody who actually has all of those features. And group hallucinations are exceptionally rare, but from the earliest sources we have, like the Gospels, the stuff that St. Paul gives us, we have good reason to think that the appearances of Jesus to the disciples were in group settings. So you have multi-sensory group hallucination experiences, and then they have this crazy belief that doesn't match the Jewish belief about the Messiah of the time. So when you start looking at the data, it gets very, very hard to explain this away naturally. Eventually, you have to come to the conclusion the simplest explanation, or the more parsimonious, as I would say, is that Jesus really did rise from the dead. That seems to be the best explanation of the data.
Hmm. What about scholars like Bart Ehrman? What are some of their arguments against Christianity, and how do you refute them?
Yeah, good question. So Bart Ehrman will say, well, a miracle is the least probable thing that could happen. This is what he has said in debates and his books. He says historians can't talk about miracles. I would disagree. And I would also say, how do you know a miracle is the least probable? Did you find that from history? No, that's a presupposition you bring to look at the data.
Mm-hmm.
If you start with a presupposition, you're never going to evaluate the data objectively.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're just going to keep saying, well, no matter what this data shows, I always have to conclude the miracle is the least probable. You're assuming naturalism, and then you're surprised you arrived at a conclusion of naturalism.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, no matter what, if you start with that presupposition, you always end with the conclusion that a miracle is the least probable. And what we say as Christians, start from a position of agnosticism and just follow the data where it leads. Stop
Mm-hmm.
assuming miracles have to be the least probable, because you're never going to actually come to a true objective conclusion. You're always going to come to a conclusion that has to jive with naturalism, and that's not being it's not being as unbiased as you possibly can be. That's really just starting with a naturalistic assumption and then making that and then interpreting the data through that lens.
Mm-hmm. So he doesn't believe miracles actually happen,
He'll
essentially.
he won't say that. He'll say miracles are the least probable. He says they could happen, but he has no way of knowing if they could happen.
Okay, interesting. Talk to me about young Earth creationism versus old Earth. What do you think is the most logical, probable, and does it align with the biblical worldview?
Yeah, I mean, like given the overwhelming science at this point, the Earth is old. This isn't even debated among experts at this point. I mean, when you look at like geology, paleontology, even like cosmology and astronomy, everything points to an old Earth and an old universe at this point. There's no way to get around that. Like we can do like uranium 235 dating, which is extremely reliable in terms of dating various rocks, and everything points to the conclusion the Earth is really, really old. Young Earth creation has come up with all sorts of ad hoc rescues to try to say, no, the Earth is young and we can explain this away. But over time, the more you look at them, the more you realize they're just explaining data away. They're just explaining it away. They're not actually giving a better explanation of the data. They're just explaining it away to fit with their view that the Earth is young. So
Mhm.
because of that, there's no reason to hold to a young Earth. Plus,
Mhm.
there's nothing in Scripture that necessarily teaches a young Earth. There's nothing that says the Earth was created at this exact point. There's various
Mhm.
interpretations of Genesis,
Right.
concordus, non-concordus views. Genesis is not written like a Genesis 1 is not written like it's a scientific textbook. It's written in a poetic fashion to tell how God took control of the cosmos and it turned it into his temple. That's the aim of Genesis 1. It's not telling you how every material thing came into existence.
Mhm.
So I think people read too much of their modern cultural lens from their modern cultural lenses when they read Genesis and they want it to be a young Earth. But even early church fathers like Clement of Alexandria or Augustine said Genesis 1 was allegorical. These days are not meant to be literal. This is
Mhm.
long before the theory of evolution was ever on the scene.
So do you think the 7 days in Genesis are literal 24-hour days, or what do you think?
So my specific view is yes, I follow the scholar John Walton. And what
Mhm.
he says is Genesis 1 is not an account of material creation. It's an account of God turning the cosmos into his temple and assigning functions. Like we see this pretty explicitly on day 4 that the greater and the lesser light are for marking days, seasons, and times. So that's their function. And scholars have noted in the Hebrew this is even more clear with the other days. God is pointing to things in creation and telling them their functions, how they're going to operate in his cosmic temple. The
Mhm.
water is going to function as seas. The dry land will function as the earth, this kind of stuff. So this is kind of what we're getting in that account. So I don't really see an issue there in terms of understanding this as in terms of a cosmic temple inauguration account. That's
Mhm.
what the ancient authors were more interested in. They didn't really care about matter and space like we do in our post Aristotelian thinking.
Mhm. What are some of the most common questions or maybe objections that you get to Christianity, and how do you answer them?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one is going to be something like the problem of evil and suffering.
Mm.
And I just, I gave a talk. I give a talk occasionally here. It's tailored for like a layman audience, like how Christianity or how sci-fi and fantasy solve the problem of evil. And what I point out is that when what we do is when we make our own stories, we always make stories with evil and suffering. But we make stories with evil and suffering that's defeated, it's triumphed over. That's what we prefer. We don't want to create stories without that. And so I think that means we intuitively recognize that the greatest of all possible worlds is a world where there is evil and suffering, but it is defeated. It's triumphed over. When evil is defeated, that's one of the greatest types of goods out there. And so, wouldn't God create a world like that? And that's the story of Christianity: God defeating evil, triumphing over it. That creates the best kinds of goods, and
Mhm.
that'd be the greatest type of possible worlds.
Mhm.
So that's one of the biggest objections.
Mhm.
Other objections is they say there's no evidence for things like the Exodus or the resurrection. And of course, I push back on that kind of stuff, like I've done here with the resurrection. You just sort of go into the historical accounts and you point to evidence.
Is there evidence of the Exodus?
Oh, there's a ton of evidence for the Exodus.
Like what?
Well, the main problem is most Christians are looking in the wrong time period. They're looking in 1400s BC. Really, most scholars that believe in historical Exodus believe it happened in the Ramesside period, so under Ramesses II. So when Cecil B. DeMille made the movie The Ten Commandments, he actually consulted like experts in Egyptology
Mhm.
to the most likely time period of the Exodus, and that's why Ramesses II is the villain in that movie,
Mhm.
because that's what historians are saying, and that's what they're still saying. We know there was a city called Avaris, which a lot of people have talked about. It was a Semitic population lived there. But the city wasn't abandoned until the Ramesside period. They lived in that city for a long time. It was not abandoned in the 1400s or the 1300s. It was abandoned in the 1200s BC during the time of Ramesses. Uh, Plus, at that site, we have found no pig bones. Now, about 40 years later in Canaan, even atheistic historians, non Christian historians like William Deaver, Israel Finkelstein, recognized there was a population explosion in Canaan. So Avaris is abandoned, the Semitic population is abandoned. 40 years or so later, like a generation later, there's a population explosion in the hill country of Canaan, which is where Israel settled. And those new sites have no pig bones.
Mhm.
So it's like, plus that's when we see the Mount Ebal site set up that Joshua 8 mentions. Shiloh is resettled. That's when Hazor is destroyed. That's when the walled structure at Jericho seems to disappear. Everything aligns with the 1200s.
Mhm.
And so, because when we look at the actual archaeological evidence, it all fits with that. Plus, when you look at internal evidence in the Pentateuch, it aligns with the Ramesside period as well. These are
Mhm.
people coming out of a Ramesside period writing the account of the Exodus based on loan words, customs they bring about, toponyms, all sorts of things. So everything points to that. I have a documentary on my channel called Exodus Rediscovered where I
Mhm.
go into that. I mean, it's like 2 hours over 3 parts because there's so much data for the Exodus.
So cool. What do you think about the argument that Moses stole from like ancient Egyptians and things that they had already created at the time?
Yeah, that's actual evidence I use. I mean, look at the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah.
It's steeped in Egyptian ritual furniture, and Egyptian ritual furniture that aligns with the Ramesside period.
Mhm.
Uh, this is actually useful data we can help to date the Exodus. If fiction writers were crafting this account, they would not have made the Ark of the Covenant look like Egyptian ritual furniture from that time period. They would have made it look like the furniture from Egypt from the Iron Age or later,
Mhm.
but they don't do that. So they actually help align that kind of stuff. It helps with that actually. And so yeah, the Song of the Sea, Exodus 15, aligns very much with the Kadesh inscription from the Ramesside period in terms of its style and everything else. Joshua Berman talks about this in his book Inconsistency in the Torah.
What do you think about some of the arguments that Jesus, some of the stories in the Bible were taken from like ancient Egypt mythology or ancient mythology around that time period?
Yeah, there's no evidence of that. It's too convoluted and too much assumptions.
Mm.
I would always like what specifically. You can find similarities, motifs, themes, but you don't find exact stories.
Mhm.
And I think you need a lot more than that. I'm gonna upload a video soon on my channel. Was like Moses copied from the Legend of Sargon
Mhm.
because both of them were put in a basket and put in a river. And when you really look at the stories, that's the only similarity in them. I mean, there's so many. There's you can the amount of differences you can't even count on your hands, on your fingers because there's so many differences. So we just can't cherry pick out like one or two similarities and assume yes they're copying. That's often what happens with people
Mhm.
trying to make these connections between stories.
Got it. What about that Jesus went to India?
I mean, it's a joke compared to it's laughable to modern historians.
Any
Like
evidence that he went, or is this just like people can say anything on the internet,
I
basically?
mean, people can say anything they want on the internet. There's no evidence he went to India. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a group in there's a heretical group in Islam called the Ahmadis, and they believe Jesus Christ did return, but he came in like the spirit of this guy called Mirza Ghulam Ahmed, who lived in India, and he claimed Jesus survived the crucifixion, then went off to India and was buried there, and they know where his tomb is. They've not let archaeologists look at that tomb. Any expert that's commented on that said this is not a tomb that's 2,000 years old.
Mhm.
So yeah, there's no evidence. And then I debated an Ahmadi like a year ago on if Jesus survived the crucifixion, and their arguments are terrible. I mean, the guy's really nice, but the arguments are terrible. So yeah, there's no evidence he went to India. There's nothing in the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th century mention this. You don't get stuff mentioned about Jesus in India till like 500 years ago or so.
Really.
Nothing really that old now. It's utter nonsense.
Speaking of utter nonsense, the whole Billy Carson, Wesley Huff debate, um, what were your thoughts on uh, the whole thing of the exposure and all the nonsense?
Well, I was really happy with with it. I mean, I've been doing responses to Billy Carson for years,
Yeah.
which is calling him out on his abject nonsense, and he never like deals with any criticism.
Hmm.
So like it was really great to get a critic catch him in a room where he could really pin him on some of the lies he's been peddling, because it was good for his followers to see you know what he gets wrong, and he's not this major expert because he claims to be like the leading expert in Sumerian tablets. Okay, that is so wrong on so many levels. Like there are legit Assyriologists that can read Sumerian, that are
Right.
translated tablets, that are legit experts. This guy doesn't even speak the Sumerian or Akkadian or any ancient language. He's
Yeah.
not a leading expert on any of this stuff, but he was claiming that kind of stuff. So I think it was great for his followers to see that he's a charlatan and he's a liar, he's a grifter, and he needs to be called out for that kind of stuff.
I think like his whole thing just proves how easy it is for people to get deceived when someone speaks with so much confidence and authority, even though they have no idea what the heck they're talking about.
Yeah, yeah, I know exactly. Yeah, it's pretty much Billy Carson in a nutshell.
Yeah, I'm like he sounds like he knows what he's saying, but yeah, that was crazy. So you've been talking about Islam quite a bit. How do we as Christians address the problem, I would say, of Islam without, so I think like the big thing is like you don't want to be an Islamophobic, but like at the same time, we need to be able to speak truth in love and address this issue.
Yeah,
So
I'm at the point now where you can just call me an Islamophobe. Like, I
there you
mean,
go.
honestly, like Islam is bad.
Yeah.
It is evil.
Why? Why is it bad? Why are we not worshiping the same God? Like I think because I think that's like some of the things that people actually do believe. So let's like kind of dive there.
Yeah, I mean, let's just look at what comes out of the Islamic world. Child marriage, polygamy, wife beating. I mean, I have actual research showing this kind of stuff. About 2 years ago, a Muslim decided to challenge me on a debate because I was attacking their prophet. And he said, "All right, fine. I challenge you to debate if child marriage should be legal today."
Mhm.
And the reason he did that is because I was pointing out Muhammad married Aisha when she was 6, and then he consummated the marriage when she was 9 years old, and that was evil. And so he didn't want to just try to explain it away. He didn't want to argue that no, no, she was actually older. He was like, no, Muhammad did that, and it's a good thing, and we should be doing it today. I was dumbfounded. So I debated him, destroyed him, proud of that. Uh,
Love it.
no apologies. I mean,
Yeah.
this is evil. I mean, anyone advocating for sexualizing children is evil, and Islam allows for that. Islam allows for that because the Quran says Muhammad is an excellent moral example, and he was a pedophile. He was a non-exclusive pedophile. So, I mean, at the end of the day, we need to stop that. And people will say, well, not all Muslims think that. I mean, like, but the majority are okay with child marriage.
Mhm.
The minority are groups like the mystics or modernist Muslims. If the modernist Muslims get control and they become the majority, I'll back off because they're in agreement with me. But I have to go after what the majority of Islam is saying. It's the traditional Sunnis, and even the traditional Shiites can be just as bad in terms of how they what they advocate for. We see Islam in research leads to more violence, authoritarianism, more discrimination. It leads to polygamy, which is extremely harmful to women. Leads to consanguineous marriages. That's marrying a family member, like an uncle or a cousin. Yeah, that's evil. That's bad. That results in so many problems for offsprings. Compare that with Christianity. I mean, it's like night and day. One is light, one is dark.
Mhm.
So we need to call Islam out for what it is and what it's doing. Unless
Mhm.
it goes through a transformation and becomes more Christian like,
Mhm.
it's going to be evil. We need to call that out and just point out what it is. And quite frankly, we need to stop tiptoeing around the subject.
Yeah.
Okay, we need because people need to be shocked into reality of what it is. When I debated that Muslim on child marriage, there was a guy in the audience who came down to Texas. That's where the debate was from, up I think Minnesota or Wisconsin area, and he just came up to me like shocked. He did not even understand this is what Islam was arguing for. He could not even believe it. It shocked him into the reality of how bad Islam is, and that's what we need people to experience. So I'm not worried if people are going to call me Islamophobe. I'm going to call out Islam for what it is. It's evil. And until the modernist Muslims or the Ismailis become the majority of the Muslims, I can call it out for what it is because the majority represent most likely what the beliefs are of it. And again, it's night and day when you compare it to Christianity.
Yeah, I've lived in a 95% Muslim nation and know like someone really well who took his second wife and was just like wasn't happy with the first one, so I'll just take another one and kind of like leave her. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah, so there's definite problems there. Why is the Quran false?
Oh, I can do this in 30 seconds if you want.
Awesome.
This is a very easy argument for Christians to use.
Yeah,
Okay, so Surah 568. Remember that? You need to remember that one.
Surah 568.
Surah 568. Surah 568. It says to Christians, it says, O people of the book, you have nothing to stand on unless you observe the Torah, the gospel, and what has been revealed to you from your Lord.
Hmm.
Wow. Okay, so it's literally telling Christians not to convert to Islam. It's telling us to believe in the Torah, the gospel, and what has been revealed to us from our Lord.
Hmm.
Well, that's the New Testament, right? It's the New and the Old Testament.
Hmm.
Okay. Well, if we are to stand on that, we can read our own scriptures and see that they contradict the Quran. So, therefore, Islam is false because we are reading our own scriptures. We are to Surah 547 as well says to judge by the gospel. If we're judging by the gospel, we have to conclude Islam is false.
Hmm.
Okay, Islam is false. There, simple. See how easy that is. This
Hmm.
is a huge problem for them because whoever was writing the Quran was probably an illiterate supposed prophet who just assumed the prior scriptures agreed with his revelations, and he never bothered to check. So he kept saying, "Yeah, yeah, I'm in there. Yeah, everything I'm saying it conforms to what's in there." But he just was too ignorant to actually check, and so then he just accidentally created one of the best arguments against Islam. We call it the Islamic dilemma. Either, uh, either the prior scriptures are authoritative revelations from Allah, and that would mean Islam is false because we can see they contradict.
Hmm.
Or, but if, as Muslims claim, our scriptures have been corrupted, well, then Islam is also false because the Quran affirms the preservation, inspiration, and authority of our scriptures.
Hmm.
So either way, Islam is false. This is the Islamic dilemma. You could go to places like if a Muslim ever tries to convert you to Islam, tell him to stop. Go, no, no, Surah 2946. Again, there's another easy one to memorize. 2946 tells Muslims to say to the Christians and the Jews, we believe in what has been revealed to us and what has been revealed to you. Muslims are commanded by Allah to say they believe in our scriptures. They're not commanded to convert us away or say our scriptures are corrupted. If they say our scriptures are corrupted, they're committing shirk. They're going against what the Quran teaches.
Hmm.
So very easy ways to debunk Islam just by using the Islamic dilemma. So you just throw Surah 568 at them, Surah 2946, it's over. Like that's the end of the day. And when you watch Muslims try to get around this and try to explain away the Islamic dilemma, they are some of the worst convoluted explanations I've ever seen. They'll just lie to you and they'll say that's not what the verse is saying, but it
Hmm.
clearly is.
Hmm. What are some of the things in the Quran? So for people who think like Muslim or Islam is a peaceful religion, it's the religion of peace. What are some things in the Quran that maybe say otherwise?
Well, it's not just the Quran. We have to remember they use the Hadith as well, the Sunnah. So
Hmm.
there's all these Hadiths that need to be taken into account as well.
What
But
is the
look,
Hadith?
so the Hadith are the sayings of the Prophet, and they're collected in various things like Sahih Muslim, Sahih Al-Bukhari, Sunan Abu Dawud. These are different collections, and so like they'll rate them based on like what they would say are the best authorities. So like the best Hadith collection is Sahih Al-Bukhari, probably followed by Sahih Muslim, and then
Mhm.
the other ones follow in that line. But generally, they're all considered to be authoritative, and so they're the sayings of the Prophet. When you go through the Hadith, it's even worse than the Quran in my view. But looking at the Quran, here are some things the Quran says about women. Surah 2:23 says, "Your wives are a tilth for you, so you may plow them as you please." So yeah, Sahih Muslim 1436 says, when a man invites his wife to his bed and she does not come, and he spends the sight being angry with her, the angels curse her till the morning. Sahih al-Bukhari 2658 says, the Prophet said, isn't the witness of a woman equal to half of that of a man? The woman said, yes. The Prophet said, this is because of the deficiency of a woman's mind. Surah 434 allows Muslims to hit women, their wives. It says basically, if if your wife is being disobedient, you sternly correct her. If she still is being a disobedient, you don't share the bed with her, so you kick her out of the bed. And then if she persists, you strike her. It's the word in Arabic, to strike. Uh, Aisha narrated in Sahih al-Bukhari 58:25 saying that the Muslim women were being abused more than anyone. She even said, was speaking of one Muslim woman, her skin was greener than her clothes. Her clothes, like it's insane, like what you read here. I mean, there's so many issues. Like Surah 4:3 allows for polygamy up to 4 wives, except for Muhammad because he was so special he could have 9. Uh, Surah 33:50 allows sex slaves. If you capture women in war, you're allowed to keep them as sex slaves. Surah 33:50. And if you look at narrations like Jamiat Tirmidiyah, I always forget how to pronounce this one book collection, but it actually says this kind of stuff. Sunan Abu Dawud 2155 as well. 2155, yeah, it is commenting on this narration. It talks about how, yeah, Muhammad got a revelation that you could keep women as sex slaves. Specifically, here's what it says. Okay, so the Apostle of Allah sent a military expedition to Atas on the occasion of the Battle of Hunain. They met their enemy and fought with them. They defeated them and took them captive. Some of the companions of the apostle were reluctant to have relations with the female captives because of their pagan husbands. So Allah the Exalted sent down the Quranic verse, all the married women unto you, save those captives whom your right hand possesses. This is to say that they are lawful for them when they complete their waiting period. So in other words, capture women in war, you can use them as sex slaves. And this is in the Quran. This is in the Hadith collection. It's terrifying. And of course, Sahih al-Bukhari 51:34 narrates that Aisha was basically abused at age 9 when Muhammad consummated the marriage to her. Like, this is pretty evil stuff. So I go to
What
Muslim sources.
what does it say about non-Muslims? So like what does it say about Christians? And then what does it say if someone leaves Islam?
I mean, so apostasy laws are not in the Quran.
Okay.
This seems to be something like what Tom Holland says is this is something that actually Islam adopted from the Zoroastrian religion.
Hmm.
Originally, Islam was probably not too. Islam was probably more inclusive early on. Robert Hoyland talks about this. That the original Arab coalition probably consisted of Muslims, Jews, and Christians, and you could be a Christian or a Jew and work with the Muslims, and you considered part of the people, and it was okay. Later on, that changed, and they started to get more exclusivist in how they would look at these things. And so they started pushing back on that and changing things. So, and then they, of course, had the apostasy laws they adopted from the Zoroastrian religion. But when it comes to like uh, Christians, the Quran is hopelessly contradictory. It tells Christians, that you judge by your own books and all this stuff. But then you can read like Surah like 98:6. Verily, those who disbelieve in the religion of Islam, the Quran, and the Prophet Muhammad from among the people of the scriptures, that is, Jews and Christians, will abide in the fire of hell. They are the worst of creatures. So Jews and Christians are the worst of creatures if we don't believe in Muhammad in Islam.
Hmm.
It seems as though Muhammad was trying to set up this like inclusivist religion, and he was like, just believe in me because I'm preaching the same thing as your scriptures. And the Jews and Christians were like, no, you're contradicting. So he got angry, and he's like, this revelation came down. I mean, you can find all this kind of stuff in the Quran. It's kind of crazy, really, when you go through it.
Mm-hmm. Should we in the West and in America be concerned about the Islamification of the West?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Why?
There's nothing
Why should this like actually be concerning?
because Islam politics flows down from culture, but culture flows down from religion.
Mm-hmm.
You give it a couple generations, and the majority of the population become Muslim, you will see cultural changes, and then you'll see political changes. There's a reason in the research we see Islam is correlated with more discrimination, authoritarianism, more war, violence, conflict. That's because this comes from teachings of Islam. These are cultural ideas, political ideas that will flow from Islam. Christians will be turned into dhimmis. Will have to pay a second-class citizen tax We won't be allowed freedom of thought, freedom of expression. It's illegal under the Sharia for Christians to proselytize Muslims. It's illegal for us to build or renovate churches. They have like coercion tactics in Sharia to slowly eradicate Christianity and Judaism slowly but surely, making people want to convert to Islam because they have special privileges. And this is why we see, go back 1,000 years, there was a ton of Christians in places like Egypt and Syria. And now there's like 1% to like 10% in various nations. Why? Well, this is what Islam leads to. They're they're bent on world domination. They're bent on turning the entire world Muslim. Christians are bent on turning the entire world Christian, but it's through peaceful evangelism.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus didn't command war and conquest. It's the exact opposite with Islam. It's
Mm-hmm.
about violently subjugating the world through any means necessary. And this is why out of Arabia, the earliest Muslims did that. They went on conquest and they tried to conquer as much land as possible.
Mm-hmm.
This is what Muhammad did, and this is what he wanted. So we need to be ready for that, and we need to be against it as much as we possibly can be. As I said, Christianity is light, Islam is darkness.
Mm-hmm.
There, there's no
Say
comparison
it
here.
again. Say it again. Say it again.
Christianity is light, Islam is darkness.
Okay.
One leads to all sorts of great human progress. One has led to all sorts of human conflicts,
Mm-hmm.
human issues, human problems. I mean, there's no comparison. I'm not saying everything in Christendom is perfect. I'm not saying everything in Islam is bad, but there's a clear difference here between what Islam has created and what Christianity has created.
Yeah. I think it's important that we're just like aware of the problems. The church my mom grew up in Minneapolis is now a mosque, as is
Mm.
her whole neighborhood where she grew up outside of Minneapolis. It's kind of crazy. How what should we do? So like clearly this is a problem. How do we as everyday believers actually stand up to Islam and the Islamification of our nation?
Yeah, good question. So first thing we need to do is we need to evangelize, bring more people into Christianity for sure. That's important. We cannot become idle on that. We cannot become lax. We cannot be worried about being Islamophobic. We
Hmm.
need to be
That's a big
courageous
one.
and
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah. We need to be courageous in how we deal with Islam, and we need to go forward. Have more children.
Yeah.
Christians are already pretty good at doing that, but Muslims are even better at having more children. This is a
Oh yeah.
problem. But I mean, like, there's hope. Like, there's a guy in my church who's got 12 kids. I was speaking at a church this weekend. The pastor had 6 kids. Another guy had 4 kids who invited me. So we need to have build those kinds of family structures. We need to raise our kids up. We cannot expect to outsource Sunday school to the church. You need to be your child's Bible teacher.
Hmm.
I go through the Bible with my own daughter and read it to her, and she reads parts of it. This is something we need to do. We need to be our own kids' Bible teachers. They
Hmm.
need to see we're committed, and we need to train them to be committed.
Hmm.
Otherwise, we will get lukewarm, and Islam will. That's great breeding ground for Islam.
Hmm. Yeah. So average children in a Muslim family, because they can have up to 5 wives, right?
4.
4 wives. And then, because I know in Senegal, each family they're huge. Huge, like it's crazy. Like they could have 15 children in
Hmm.
family with one guy.
Well, here's the silver lining though. Polygamy is actually very detrimental
Hmm.
for population growth. People don't realize this. It is, but I mean, think about it. So you're not spreading the gene pool around a lot because you have one man passing on his gene to through multiple women. That's gonna lead to more birth defects over time, not like necessarily 1 or 2 generations, but that's happening. That's gonna be a problem. But
Hmm.
think about it. I mean, humans have generally produced 50% male, 50% female.
Hmm.
Right now, there's actually more men in the world than women by a slight advantage.
Hmm.
Now, if you have a bunch of men taking 4 wives, that's going to be less women for all the other men. What do? They join militia groups, gangs, terrorist organizations because they're frustrated. So it actually leads to deterioration. Some things in Islam, like their promotion of consanguineous marriages, cousin marriages, that is, or polygamy, actually harm their overall goals.
Hmm.
So there is some things in there that we should be, relieved about
Hmm.
in terms of the advancement and the encouragement of Islam. So we do have that at least.
Okay. Um, Can you explain the controversy around Constantine's role in shaping Christianity?
Yeah, it's a bunch of myth. Constantine didn't shape Christianity. You need to read his actual work. So before he resided over the Council of Nicaea, he resided over another council to just deal with disputes between Christians and this heretical sect called the Donatists. And he said in his own letters, "I'm deferring to the bishops. The bishops are going to decide this, not me. They are the vicars of Christ. They're going to decide this stuff." He did the same mentality was present at Nicaea. He wasn't changing anything. He was just allowing for a much more pro-Christian environment for things to foster and develop. At one point, like the bishop of Egypt, Athanasius, he was invited by Constantine to a council in Caesarea. He didn't go. The council was called off, and no punishments were ever doled out. I mean, Constantine didn't have this iron grip on the church like people think. It's a huge myth.
Mm-hmm. Interesting how people can just say whatever they want and then it spreads and that becomes like what people actually believe to be true.
Mm-hmm.
If someone wants to start learning more about apologetics and defending their faith, what do you think are some of the just like best arguments for them to learn, and then how can they get started?
Yeah, well, we need to learn arguments that are going to defend the Bible. So learn an argument to defend the resurrection, learn arguments for gospel reliability and New Testament reliability, learn arguments to deal with Old Testament issues like did God command genocide. A great book is the book Did God Command Genocide?
Mm-hmm.
Great book to start with there, as well as books like Matthew Lynch, like Flood and Fury. Um, uh, Trying to think of another book. I can't remember it right now though, but those are good places to start. Go through videos on my channel. I make independent videos for different topics, so you can find things you want to study and research. Because we're called to be a kingdom of priests, men and women. That means we all should be trained to
Yeah.
think through these things and study these things, and not want to shy away from these kinds of things. So everyone should be an apologist in their own right to some extent.
Mm-hmm. And just to give you a plug for your channel, it's amazing. So everyone should go and check out. You have so many videos, so much great content, so well researched, and engaging. So you've done an incredible job. So I would send everyone just to your channel to learn more.
Thank you.
Besides your YouTube channel, where can we connect with you?
You can follow me on Twitter, which is
Okay.
now X. I'm on Facebook. I just started growing a lot on Facebook, surprisingly, as well as Instagram, TikTok. It's all just Inspiring Philosophy. If you look
Okay.
that up, you'll find it. Those are the best ways. You can support us through the website, inspiringphilosophy.com, and you can help us keep growing because we're still underfunded. So the more donations we get, the more we'll be able to keep making videos. So that's where you can support us, and that's where you can follow us.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, appreciate it.